I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for Mideast Realities. Edward Said is one of the most profound thinkers, writers, and commentators of our time. One of the most influential humanists of our generation is how he is introduced in just a few moments. He also happens to be Palestinian. Born in Jerusalem, Said's family fled to Cairo when the civil war between Jews and Arabs broke out in British Mandate Palestine after World War II. Then, as a boy, he came to the United States. Said is one of the best-known professors at Columbia University, where he holds a distinguished and endowed chair in English comparative literature. As you will hear in the upcoming introduction, he has held nearly every major fellowship known to man or beast, and has delivered some 27 endowed lectures. Said is in demand throughout the world at major universities, not only in the field of literature, but as a social critic and political analyst. Though in his early years at Columbia, Said was not greatly politically involved, he became more and more so in the 70s and 80s. He was in fact a prominent member of the Palestine National Council during the time when the PLO was most ostracized and vilified in the U.S. In recent years, especially since the Gulf War and the agreements that followed between Israel and what was the PLO, Edward Said has become one of the most outspoken dissenters from and critics of U.S. foreign policy, Yasser Arafat, and developments in the Middle East region. Said's books and articles have been widely published throughout the world in many languages. Orientalism, published in 1978, is considered a defining treatise on the subject of Western cultural and social imperialism. In this series of 4 Mideast Realities programs, we are very pleased to be able to bring you one of Edward Said's most interesting and provocative recent lectures. The title of the lecture is The Clash of Civilizations, and Said delivered it at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in November of '95. What Said discusses is, of course, much broader than just contemporary Middle East events. But what he discusses is actually of considerable importance in providing the vital background necessary to really appreciate these events and put them in historical perspective. And during the lecture, and even more so in the question and answer period, Said specifically comments about Israeli-Palestinian developments in the past few years, comments that are of extreme importance and should be very carefully pondered.
Each civilizational camp, you will notice, there are official representatives of the culture or civilization who make themselves into its mouthpiece. You know, people like William Bennett, who's going around telling us what our virtues really are. I mean, I didn't vote for Bennett, I didn't appoint him to that, but that function seems to exist now, proliferating as a function within cultures and countries. People who appoint themselves the spokesman of what our real values and traditions are, whose role is to, or they assign themselves the role of articulating our essence. But this always requires a considerable amount of compression, exaggeration, and reduction. So on the first and the most immediate level then, statements about what our culture or civilization is, or ought to be, necessarily involve a contest over the definition. If you're going to say ours, you have to be able to say what we are. How do we define ourselves? This is certainly true of Huntington, who writes his essay at a time in the U.S. when a great deal of turmoil has been occurring around the very definition of Western civilization. I would say this is the worst possible time to venture large generalizations about Western civilizations, because that's exactly what's being debated. What is Western civilization? Recall, for example, that in this country, many college campuses have been shaken during the past 20 years over what the canon of Western civilization was, what books should be taught, which ones read, not read, and so on. Places like Stanford, I'm sure Wisconsin as well, Columbia, every place you can think of, debated the issue not simply as a matter of academic concern, but because the definition of the West and consequently of America were at stake. Anyone who has the slightest understanding of how cultures work knows that defining that culture, or that civilization, saying what it is for members, is always a major democratic contest. There are always canonical authorities to be selected and regularly revised, debated, selected, or dismissed. There are ideas of good and evil, ideas of value to be specified, discussed and settled, or not, as the case may be. Moreover, each culture defines its enemies, what stands beyond it and threatens it. For the Greeks, for instance, beginning with Herodotus, anyone who didn't speak Greek was automatically a barbarian and other to be despised and fought against. In every society, the official culture is that of priests, academies, and the state. It provides, all of these provide definitions of patriotism, loyalty, boundaries, and belonging. It is this official culture that speaks in the name of the whole, that tries to express the general will, that the general idea, which inclusively holds in the official past the founding fathers, the texts, the pantheon of heroes and villains, and excludes what is foreign or different or undesirable or inferior. From it come the definitions of what may or may not be said, those prohibitions that are necessary to any culture if it is to have authority. It's also true that in addition to the mainstream or official or canonical culture and civilization, there are always dissenting, and this Huntington has no idea about, there are always dissenting, alternative, unorthodox, heterodox cultures within civilizational camps like Islam or the West or Japan that contain many anti-authoritarian strains in them in competition with the official culture. These can be called the counterculture that Newt Gingrich is always bothering on about without ever showing any sign of understanding it. The counterculture, which is an ensemble of practices associated with different kinds, various kinds of outsiders, the poor, immigrants, artistic bohemians, workers, rebels, artists. From the counterculture comes the critique of authority and attacks on what is official and orthodox. The great contemporary Arab poet Adonis has written a massive account of the relationship between orthodoxy and heterodoxy in Arab Islamic culture. I'm sure Bernard Lewis never read it. Probably doesn't exist. And certainly Huntington has no conception of it. And Adonis has shown the constant dialectic within the world of Islam between the official and the unofficial. No culture, in my opinion, is understandable without some sense of this ever-present source of creative provocation from the unofficial to the official. To disregard the sense of restlessness within each culture and to assume that there's complete homogeneity between culture and identity is to miss what is vital in culture. In the United States, the debate about what is American has gone through a large number of transformations and sometimes dramatic shifts. As I was growing up, for example, in the Middle East, I used to look at Western films which depicted Native Americans as devils to be destroyed or tamed. They were called Red Indians. And insofar as they had any function in the culture at large, it was to be a foil to the advancing course of white civilization. Today this has changed completely. Native Americans are seen as victims, not villains, of the country's Western progress. There's even been a change, even more dramatic change perhaps, in the status of Columbus. There are even more dramatic reversals in the depiction of African Americans and of women. Toni Morrison has noted how it is that in classic American literature there's an obsession with whiteness. Moby Dick, Arthur Gordon Pym. Yet she says the major male and white writers of the 19th and 20th centuries, men who shaped the canon of what we have known as American literature, created their works by using whiteness as a way of avoiding, curtaining off, rendering invisible the black African presence in the midst of the society. The very fact that Toni Morrison writes her novels and criticism with such success and brilliance now underscores the extent of the change from the world of Melville and Hemingway to that of Du Bois, Baldwin, Langston Hughes, and Toni Morrison. Which vision is the real American? And who can lay claim to represent and define it? The question is a complex and deeply interesting one, but it can't be settled by reducing the whole matter to a few cliches. A recent view of the difficulties involved in cultural contests whose object is the definition of a civilization, can be found in Arthur Schlesinger's book, The Disuniting of America, and I think it should be read as a kind of counterpoint to Huntington's essay. As a mainstream historian, Schlesinger is troubled by the fact that emergent and immigrant groups in the U.S. have disputed the official unitary fable of America as it used to be represented by the great classical historians of the country, men like Bancroft and Henry Adams and so on. They want the writing of history to reflect not only in America, these new groups, not only in America want history to reflect not only in America that was conceived of and ruled by patricians and landowners, but in America in which slaves, servants, laborers, and poor immigrants played an important, but as yet unacknowledged role. The narratives of such people, silenced by the great discourses whose source was Washington, the great industrial fortunes of the Middle West, the investment banks of New York, the universities of New England, have come now to disrupt the slow progress and unruffled serenity of the official stories. The new groups, the immigrants, the women, the eccentrics, ask questions, interject the experiences of social unfortunates, and make the claims of frankly lesser peoples, women, Asian, African Americans, various other minorities, sexual as well as ethnic. Whether or not one agrees with Schlesinger, there's no disagreeing with his underlying thesis that the writing of history is the royal road to the definition of a country and of a civilization, that the identity of a society is in large part a function of historical interpretation, which is fraught unendingly with claims and counterclaims. There's a similar debate about definitions inside the Islamic world, and this too Huntington has no conception of, and his article just glosses over it as if it doesn't exist. Everybody knows what Islam is, everybody knows what the West is, everybody knows what Slavic culture is, whereas in fact I think a lot of people don't know and are asking questions and saying, which is the version we want? And this is especially true, I think, within the Islamic world, which is in the often hysterical outcry about the threat of Islam in the West, about Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, one encounters so often in the Western media and in the mouths of politicians like President Clinton, who goes to the Middle East and gives speeches only about terrorism and violence, completely ignoring the fact that hundreds of thousands of millions of people are undergoing violence, injustice, poverty, suffering that provokes people. And of course the question is not that there is terrorism, but why there isn't more of it, given the incredible inequalities that exist there. But no, all we pay attention to is is Islamic fundamentalism. And there really is, by the way, I mentioned it earlier, and you laughed, and perhaps one should laugh, but there is something called a fundamentalism project, for which hundreds of thousands of dollars have been appropriated by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, by the University of Chicago, and so on. All they do is sit around and read these things and say, oh, well, it's terrible, fundamentalism, and so on and so forth. But what is forgotten and overlooked is the fact that, like every other major world civilization, Islam contains within it an astonishing variety of currents and countercurrents, most of them undiscerned by tendentious Orientalist scholars for whom Islam is an object of fear and hostility, or by journalists who don't know any of the languages or relevant histories. I met, for example, a journalist who writes for the New York Times, Judith Miller, spent 20 years writing about Islamic fundamentalism in the Arab world, doesn't know a word of Arabic. It's incredible. And people like that are content to rely on persistent stereotypes that have lingered in the West since the 10th century. Very little attention paid, for example, in the official U.S. media to what's going on in Iran today. Iran is in the throes of an enormous debate, stunningly energetic debate about law, freedom, personal responsibility, and tradition, all of it concerning Islam that is simply not covered by Western reporters. And of course, the scholars are worse than the reporters. And if you look at Islam in the Arab world, Far from there being a surge of Islamic fundamentalism, as it's reductively described in the Western media, there is a great deal of secular opposition to it, of which I count myself a member, in the form of various contests over the interpretation of Sunnah in matters of law, personal conduct, political decision-making, and so on. Moreover, what is often forgotten is that movements like Hamas and Islamic Jihad on the West Bank are essentially protest movements that go against the capitulationist politics of the PLO and mobilize the will to resist Israeli occupation practices, the expropriation of land, etc., which still goes on, even though there's this, wonderful peace process that we all feel so good about. So I find it surprising and indeed disquieting that Huntington gives no indication anywhere in his essay that he's aware of these disputes, or that he realizes that the nature and identity of a civilization are never taken as unquestioned axioms by every single member of that civilization. Far from the Cold War being the defining horizon of the past few decades, I would say that it is this extremely widespread attitude of questioning and skepticism towards age-old authorities that characterizes the post-war world in both East and West. Nationalism and decolonization forced the issue by bringing whole populations to consider the question of nationality in the era after the white colonists have left. In Algeria, for example, today the site of a bloody contest between Islamists, an aging and discredited government and military, the debate has taken violent forms. But it's a real debate and a fierce contest nonetheless over what is Algeria, what should it be. Having won from the French in 1962, the National Front for the Liberation of Algeria declared itself to be the bearer of a newly liberated Algerian, Arab, and Muslim identity. For the first time in the modern history of Algeria, Arabic became the language of instruction. State socialism became its political creed, non-alignment its foreign affairs position. In the process of conducting itself as a one-party embodiment of all these things, the FLN grew into a massive, atrophied bureaucracy, its economy depleted, its leaders stagnating in the position of an unyielding oligarchy. Opposition arose not only from Muslim clerics and leaders, but from the Berber minority, submerged in the all-purpose discourse of a supposedly single Algerian identity. The political crisis of the past several years after the elections of 1991 represents a several-sided contest for power and for the right to decide the nature of Algerian identity. What is Islamic about it? What kind of Islam? What is national? What is Berber? What is Arab? And so on. That's what's at stake in Algeria. To Huntington, what he calls civilization identity is a stable and undisturbed thing, like a room full of furniture in the back of your house. This is extremely far from the truth, not just in the Islamic world, but throughout the entire surface of the globe. To emphasize the differences between cultures and civilizations is completely to ignore the literally unending debate or contest about defining the culture of civilization within these civilizations, including several Western ones. These debates completely undermine any idea of a fixed identity. This is the point I'm getting to finally. That there is no such thing as a fixed identity which can be subsumed under labels like the West or the Slavs or the Japanese or the Africans, which Huntington considers to be a sort of ontological fact of political existence. You don't have to be an expert on China, Japan, India to know that. This is taking place everywhere. And we know it in our own experience in America. I talked about this a moment ago. Or there's the German case, in which a major debate has been taking place ever since the end of World War II about the nature of German civilization, as to whether Nazism derived logically from its core, or whether it was an aberration. But there's more to the question of identity even than that. In the field of cultural and rhetorical studies, a series of recent advances and discoveries have given us a much clearer insight into not only the contested dynamic nature of cultural identity, but into the extent to which the very idea of identity itself involves fantasy, manipulation, invention, construction. If you look, for example, at Hayden White's book, published during the 1970s, the book was called Meta-History, which is a study of several 19th century historians, Marx, Michelet, Nietzsche, and others. White makes the point, I think, beyond argument, that these historians determined what history was by the kind of figures and language that they use, so that rhetoric determines the vision of history. So that Marx, as he writes, is committed to a poetics of irony, and this produces a particular historical vision. And the point of White's quite brilliant analysis is that he shows us how histories are best understood not according to criteria of realness, but rather as to how their internal rhetorical and discursive strategies work. It is these rather than facts that make the visions of people like Tocqueville or Croce or Marx actually work as a system. The effect of White's book, as much as also the effect of Foucault's study, is to draw attention away from the existence of confirmations for ideas that might be provided by the natural world, and focus it instead on the kind of language used, which they've taught us to see as shaping the components of a writer's vision. Rather than the idea of clash, for instance, deriving from a real clash in the world, we would then come to see it as deriving instead from the strategies of Huntington's prose and his own interests, which in turn relies on what I would call a managerial poetics, a strategy for assuming the existence of stable, metaphorically defined entities called civilizations, which the writer proceeds quite emotively to manipulate, as in the phrase from Huntington. Listen to this. The crescent-shaped Islamic bloc from the bulge of Africa to Central Asia has bloody borders. I'm not saying that Huntington's language is emotive and shouldn't be, but rather that quite revealingly it is the way all language functions in the poetic way analyzed by Hayden White. What is evident from Huntington's language is the way he uses figurative language to accentuate the difference between our world, normal, acceptable, familiar, logical, and, as an especially striking example, the world of Islam with its bloody borders, bulging contours, crescent shape, all that suggests something really deeply disturbing. And that's what he's trying to do, make you afraid. This suggests not so much analysis on Huntington's part, but a series of determinations which create the very clash he seems in his essay to be discovering and pointing to. Too much attention paid to managing and clarifying the clash of cultures obliterates the fact of a great, often silent exchange and dialogue between them. What civilization today, whether Japanese, Western, European, Korean, Chinese, or Indian, has not had long, intimate, and extraordinarily rich contacts with other cultures, civilizations? There's no exception to this exchange at all. One would wish that conflict managers would have paid attention to and understood the meaning of the mingling of different musics in world music, in rock, for example, or in the work of high, serious composers like Olivier Messiaen or Toru Takemitsu, in which East and West blend together in music. Much the same is true of literature, where readers of Garcia Marquez, Naguib Mahfouz, Kenzaburo Owe exist far beyond the boundaries imposed by language and action. There's a collective enterprise in culture which the people who proclaim the clash of civilization and cultures completely miss. One thinks of the lifelong dedication that has existed in all modern societies among scholars, artists, musicians, visionaries, and prophets to try to come to terms with the other, with that other society or culture that seems so foreign and so distant. One thinks of Joseph Needham, the great Cambridge chemist who spent his life studying China, or in France, Louis Massignon, the great Orientalist who did his own pilgrimage within the world of Islam. It seems to me that unless we emphasize and maximize the spirit of cooperation and humanistic exchange.
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.